Welcome. Last week, the Supreme Court saved 34,000 lives, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. 34,000 per year, in fact. How so? Well, in effect, the justices ruled that the EPA can demand power plants clean up or shut down when too much pollution wafts into other states. In a moment, what that means for the New York region and potentially your family. Also on tonight's program, political protest. Why does it so often fail, and what makes it succeed? In our public intellectual segment, where we look at research with the power to change our minds and public policy, high school graduation rates, they're up, but one researcher doubts that means more kids are truly ready for today's colleges. And finally, the New York Public Library invents a crowdsourcing app to remap the city's past. First, though, that historic pollution ruling. With us, two guests. Skyping in from D.C. is John Walke, a senior attorney and director of the Natural Resources Defense Council's Clean Air Program. And in the studio is Frederica Perera, professor at the Mailman School of Public Health and director of the Columbia Center for Children's Environmental Health. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Mr. Walke in D.C., first tell us from the NRDC's perspective, what's the significance of this ruling? And I have to say, I was a little shocked, even as one who once upon a time studied Dr. Perera's environmental health syllabus at Columbia, to hear that the Clean Air Act didn't automatically include protecting one state from another state's pollution. I thought that was the whole point of federal environmental legislation.
Well, you're right, Brian. It's a thorny political issue that EPA addressed in a rule that required sharp reductions in the pollution that forms smog and soot from power plants that burn coal. The problem was there was a breakdown by the upwind states to the south and west of New York that refused to exercise the political will to clean up power plants in their own states. So Congress in the Clean Air Act gave EPA the tools to protect citizens in New York and up into New England. And the court's ruling was a tremendous victory for clean air and Americans' health.
Did this surprise you, Dr. Perera, that this even needed to go to the Supreme Court to get states to clean up their polluting facilities that send pollution into other states' air?
Let's say I was very pleased to read that decision because it means good things for New Yorkers and people in our surrounding region. The emissions from coal plants are really many. They're toxic metals, mercury and lead come to mind, arsenic, also fine particles that can be inhaled deep into the lung, organic compounds that are known to be hazardous, and we've focused on one group of those in our research, and sulfur and nitrogen oxides. And all of these have been linked to health effects, to excess mortality, to more cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, and more recently we've begun to understand how very many are the effects on the neurodevelopment, the early brain development, cognitive and behavioral development of children when they are exposed very young, as well as the impact on childhood asthma. So this is very good news that we will see a reduction in levels of pollution in New York as a result of this.
John Walke, can you explain some of the geography of this? Why is New York considered a downwind state? And do we also produce pollution that other states are downwind of in relation to us?
Those are great questions, Brian. The prevailing wind patterns in the United States travel from west to east and from the southeast up the Atlantic coast into New England. So New York is a victim receptor state, if you will, but also produces some pollution that travels up into New England. One reason you might have been confused about this decision or wondering about it is because there were 6 justices on the current Supreme Court, and including 2 conservatives and the Chief Justice, that upheld these EPA standards. The reason was the law was so clearly supportive of the protective action that EPA took that it warranted only a spirited dissent from Justices Scalia and Thomas. And otherwise, the remaining justices thought that EPA had acted quite appropriately in deciding to protect the American people.
So that is a pretty decisive ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court. Dr. Perera, that number that I cited at the beginning, that the EPA estimates that 34,000 lives a year might be saved as a result of this ruling if they really do control these coal-fired power plant emissions. Is there any way to estimate how many lives will be saved in New York?
I think there probably is a way to roughly estimate that, but I haven't attempted that feat. You know, it is difficult to separate the to understand the sources of different particles and vapors, aerosols, fine particles that reach us here in New York or that are in our environment. It's hard to separate out the coal emissions from the Midwest from what we generate locally. But there's progress being made using tracer elements, for example, and different species of hydrocarbons.
And even though we're not as dependent on coal-fired power plants here, many of the same toxins and other pollutants are released by other local sources, right? We're not just all getting this from Ohio's coal plants, for example.
That's correct. So we are, for example, studying a class of organic pollutants, toxic pollutants that come from coal burning, also from oil burning, gasoline, diesel is a rich source. And so they come from they're both imported, so to speak, and locally generated. And these pollutants are known to have various health effects, mostly have been studied in adults in terms of cancer, excess cancer risk, in terms of immunotoxicity, toxicity to the immune system. But our center has done some of the first studies looking at the role of these exposures when they occur very early in life, even when the child is developing in utero, during fetal development. And we have found links between these pollutants that are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAH for short, and effects on birth outcomes, smaller birth size, effects on the early child development, developmental delays, slight reduction in IQ points for the most exposed, more behavioral symptoms, that sort of thing, and also a greater likelihood of asthma when the children are exposed both prenatally and after they're born. So this suggests that pollution that comes from these various sources is playing a role in child health, along with other factors that are known to be causal. And so it's very important to reduce these exposures as much as we can.
And John Walke, we have a map up on the screen that the viewers can see of, I guess, upwind and downwind states. Is this your map from NRDC? And explain what all those pieces of string appear to be.
Yes, I think what you have there is affectionately called the spaghetti matrix by EPA and clean air advocates. And what it shows is the pollution pathway from these so-called upwind states, which are actually all to the south and west, and the different receiving downwind states, if you will, that EPA identified as receiving excess pollution contributions from those states that was causing the downwind states like New York to suffer unhealthy air quality. This clean air program is all about equity and accountability to make sure that downwind states clean up sources in their own state, to be sure, like the diesel emissions that Dr. Perera was mentioning, but also to make sure that these responsible upwind states do their fair share and are not contributing excessively to unhealthy air quality in these downwind states. So
and just to be super clear, the blue lines, the green lines, and the red lines mean different things?
Well, I think those were adopted to provide some distinction and clarity in which state is contributing to which other states. There's no special significance to the colors apart from assignment.
I see. But it is very instructive to see how far pollution may travel within the United States. If Michigan is linked to Texas there, for example, and Texas is even linked all the way up to New York and past New York to Connecticut, and states as far south as Georgia and Mississippi and Louisiana there too. It really shows that we don't live in our own little bubbles. What we do in one place affects people in other places, doesn't it?
That's right, and one thing that the Supreme Court recognizes is that when this pollution comes out of smokestacks in Texas or Georgia, it actually cooks with sunlight and volatile organic compounds and other forms of pollution in the atmosphere as it travels up the coast and into New England. And smog, which is the mainly formed pollution product, can travel many, many hundreds of miles and is really a regional problem as well as a local problem that needs to be tackled by EPA with a comprehensive federal solution.
So, Dr. Perera, while people like John Walke are working on the federal level to reduce the pollution that's coming to New York's air from other places, what is your top priority, or are your several top priorities, for New York to do locally to protect the children who you study in particular and other New Yorkers?
I think there are several things that can be done, and some are being done and have been done. One is to decrease the emissions from motor vehicles, particularly trucks, buses, diesel burning, and also from gasoline-fueled automobiles. There have been some new laws here in the city on reduction, on banning idling of trucks while stationary. Cleanup of the bus fleet, that was a big step forward to so-called campaign to dump dirty diesels. That was very beneficial.
How about the heating oil that's used in buildings?
That's
Isn't that a
source.
huge source, and we're making progress on that with new rules?
Well, that is a big source in New York City, and there is some progress with a phase out of the dirtiest fuel oil, but the timeline is quite long, stretched out, and progress is slow, but that is a major source indeed. So not only motor vehicles, but oil burning, and then other local sources of combustion of fossil fuel in addition.
So, John, how quickly are we going to see New York's air cleaner as a result of reductions at plants in other states from this ruling?
Well, this is a good news story that's already begun. The Supreme Court decision last week will be fought over by some lawyers jousting down in Washington for the rest of this year. But in the meantime, there was a court decision 2 weeks ago that's almost equally important to sharply reduce some of these toxic metals and soot particles that Dr. Perera referred to earlier, arsenic, lead, and mercury, among others. We've already enjoyed the fruits of some of those cleanup and retirement decisions by dirty coal plants over the past year or two, that has led to really significantly cleaner air in the New York metro area and other parts of the eastern half of the United States, and we'll only see that progress improve and continue as the Supreme Court ruling is put into effect in the coming years.
Well, that is good news. And what's your ultimate goal there at NRDC? Because I framed this at the beginning as clean up or shut down the effect of the ruling, and you know the industry and some Republican politicians say there's a war on coal in the Obama administration. Is your goal as an environmentalist actually to see an end to coal power plants and the use of coal at all in the United States?
Our goal is to provide Americans with clean, healthy air and to reduce pollution from whatever fuels we use, whether that's natural gas or oil or coal, but to end up with a clean energy economy that may or may not include different mixes of fossil fuels depending on how clean they are and whether it's feasible and cost effective to continue with them. Coal is not paying its fair share vis-a-vis other forms of energy that are cleaner today. It is dumping carbon pollution that contributes to climate change in unlimited amounts into the atmosphere right now. And President Obama has announced some really historic safeguards to control that pollution that will be forthcoming in June. But the result is less pollution and better health. And however the economy and businesses decide to achieve that consistent with the law is really up to those business decisions. We just want to make sure that the public's health is protected.
John Walke, Frederica Perera, Thank you both very much.
You're very welcome, Brian.
Thank you, Brian.
Next up, why do street protests so often fail? Our next guest writes that most massive street protests around the world today are yielding too few political results for their size, often representing a giant revving engine of kinetic energy disconnected from the wheels of political progress. To quote the author, the movement doesn't move, and he points to Occupy Wall Street and other recent protests in Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, and New Delhi as examples. Why in so many cases, with seemingly such broad support, are massive marches failing to move things forward? Skyping with us now from Washington, D.C., author of The End of Power, Moisés Naím, and in our studio, we are joined by distinguished CUNY Graduate Center professor and labor movement scholar Stanley Aronowitz and John Jay College Social and Interdisciplinary Studies professor and Occupy CUNY activist Rachel Liebert. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, thanks.
And Moisés Naím, I'll start with you, and to the point of your article, do protest movements so often fail? I guess an indication might be that that list of countries and cities around the world that I just mentioned would not be so familiar to the average viewer, though they may think of Tahrir Square right off the bat, and aha, protest movements can succeed.
And of course they do, Brian. They succeed, and they succeeded in the Arab Spring. We saw that in Tunisia, in Egypt, elsewhere. We saw it in Ukraine, and we saw it in a lot of places. My point in the article that you cite is that there is the illusion that much more is happening than what actually is, and the results have been quite meager. And as you noted, my point is that there is a lack of proportion between how massive are the street protests and how thin are the results.
Some of your blame seems to lie, I don't want to say at the feet of the internet, but at the feet of the temptation that people succumb to use the internet and stop there. Is that how you would put it?
Absolutely. And I'm not the first to point that out. There is even a moniker about that. It's called Slacktivism. That meaning slackers that become activists, and they think that by just tweeting something or by liking something in Facebook or by responding to a call to show up in a street or a square in some city at a certain time with a white t-shirt, and then you see hundreds of thousands of people, that creates the illusion that there is a very powerful political force at work. And of course there is, but the problem is that that illusion is also undermines the need for face-to-face, the tedious, laborious, boring political work that requires a lot of face-to-face meetings and cajoling and negotiating and compromising, and create a structure, a strategy, and policy content that can have consequences.
So before I bring in our resident Occupy activist, you did put Occupy on that list, didn't you, of failed street protests? Do you make that case?
Well, you know, they claim that they created the context that, you know, now the 1% and 99% is part of our daily jargon, that more since, you know, that we're more aware and more actively resisting the trends towards economic inequality, and that was their contribution. And in many ways, I agree with that. But again, I have to point out the fact that at some point there were 2,600 cities around the world where the Occupy movement had taken over squares and was an important part of the national conversation, and everyone was expecting that to have far more deeper and long-lasting consequences other than creating a different conversation about inequality.
All right. So, Rachel, it's been almost 3 years now since the advent of the Occupy movement. What has it accomplished, and has it accomplished as much as you had hoped at the beginning?
I think my main addition, perhaps a criticism to the argument here, is that the actual act of protesting in and of itself is revolutionary. So the moment of being involved in a street protest is an activation of a sense of possibility, a sense of dependency, a sense of trust between people. And that kind of experience is, I think, directly challenges the fear, the individualism, the foreclosure that circulates through and drives the neoliberal security state. So I think it's really, really important that we also include an analysis or consideration of the process as well as the product when we think about what the results are or what the impact are of these kind of movements.
But is that answer in and of itself an example of Occupy getting kind of lost in its own weeds rather than have the maximal impact? Because if the Occupy folks are standing around debating how to have consensus, how to have a new kind of democracy in Zuccotti Park, while the world is going forward with the same 1% and 99% income divisions, should you be talking so much about process as opposed to results?
Yes, absolutely, because you can't separate form from content or process from product. It's absolutely crucial. I think one of the strengths of the Occupy movement was its reflexivity in terms of trying to continually think through how we do participation. And in that way, in many ways, I considered it a form of prefigurative politics. It was trying to be or become the world that we want to see. And that's not going to happen quickly, but that doesn't mean to say that it's not an effective movement.
Stanley Aronowitz, where do you enter this conversation? Are we seeing more street protest movements starting around the world these days, but a higher percentage failing?
The word failing, I think, is a little precipitous. I think that what Rachel has said has got a lot of value. There are people learning from this. But that's necessary but not sufficient. And I think that the author has made two very good points. The first good point he makes is that politics is really boring. I've been in politics a long time, and I have many, many, many parts of my days and weeks and years standing around waiting, visiting people, talking one-on-one. But unfortunately, that one-on-one daily kind of politics of reaching people in their homes and reaching people in their workplaces is really what it's all about. And I think Occupy, not only Occupy, but other protest movements think there are shortcuts, and the internet is not a shortcut for politics of that kind.
But it is a shortcut of sorts for reaching people, if that's the measure. Then you have to take steps after you reach them.
That's right.
But in terms of reaching people, there's never been a better time. Right?
Oh, that's very true. But the other part of it, which is important, is what happens when the initial surge has reached a limit and it is no longer a flow but an ebb. Then you need political organization. And the author of this article talks about the need for political organization. Now, the problem about political organization is, do you mean parties of the traditional liberal type, like the Democratic Republican Party, the Labour Party, and the Conservative Party in Britain? Or do you mean political organizations that can actually continuously educate themselves, mobilize, but form themselves as a permanent institution? And I think that's terribly important, and that was what Occupy was lacking. I met with Occupy people more than once, and they said, quote, if we accepted what you advocate, Stanley, we would split the movement. And I said to them, that's good. You probably should split the movement if what is at stake is the survival of Occupy and so on. But I do think that there's an issue that is underlying this, which is it is a process. It's a long process. I was privileged to have been part of an adult group that connected with the Students for a Democratic Society in the late 1960s. And they had nothing but meetings about process. But the difference was that they organized the first mass protest in Washington against the war in Vietnam, which was historic.
The difference between them and the Occupy movement?
Oh, yeah. But what was different was that they actually had an organization. It was an organization with a national office, with chapters. By 1965, they had 30 chapters. By 1968, they had 60,000 members.
So Rachel, let me come back to you. Is that what the Occupy movement needs to do to have its next wave of impact?
I would argue that while we don't have an organisation, what we did start to build was an infrastructure. So there was on one hand the discursive infrastructure that was referred to earlier in terms of a common language, which connected a lot of different struggles and enabled us to zoom out and see that the issue was actually the current social and political regime, and that's where change needed to be targeted. But there was also the building of a social and cultural infrastructure for mobilisation. And these great, for me, a good demonstration of that was what happened with the relief efforts after Hurricane Sandy. So from my own personal experience, it was through...
You mean Occupy folks getting out into the streets of the Rockaways and so forth
Yeah.
to help people without
Right.
going through the official government channels?
Right, absolutely, yeah. Because we already had very basic, tangible things like listservs set up, text loops, friendships, networks, knowing where different resources lay, a shared language. And people were able to move very quickly and make some very direct changes and help to people who really needed it.
Moisés Naím, since your perspective is international and in fact global, would you say the needs for a kind of infrastructure building for political change are different in more authoritarian regimes, let's say, than they are in the United States?
Absolutely, absolutely. The way you want to organize resistance and opposition in Syria is very different than the way you want to organize it in the United States or in Brazil, that have more vibrant democracies, of course. But again, here the point is a longer, larger, broader, deeper trend in which the idealists have no longer found in political parties a home. Political parties, the traditional political parties, are now repugnant for many people. And there is this illusion that you can create politics without political parties, that you can have a democracy based on movements, or on NGOs, or on solidarity groupings, or on infrastructure, whatever that means. Well, all of those are essentially different ways of calling what a political organization should be, which is a political party that knows how to organize, energize, and recruit. And as you said, the internet is very powerful. The internet is a very, very important tool to do that. But the notion that you can just rely on the internet without having a political party that does all the traditional functions, and that has a thirst for power, and that knows how to transform anxieties into policy proposals, that can take part in the national debate and can try to influence public policies. It is not enough to use these movements to air anxieties and to air. You need to go beyond that, and you need to create very concrete proposals for political and institutional economic change.
Stanley, go ahead.
Yeah, but see, a lot of the people who are active in Occupy, and a lot of the people who have been active in a number of other movements in the United States and in Western Europe, consider themselves anarchists. But there's a misunderstanding of what the history of anarchism is. They're not anarchists. They're libertarians. Now, what anarchism was a political movement which, even though it disdained electoral activity and certain concepts of public policy, it did have organization. And those organizations were pretty tight. Now, what the difficulty is that there is a confusion, it seems to me, and it's an intellectual confusion, it's a conceptual confusion between the necessity of a political party and organization. The problem is that we don't need simply social movements, and I agree with what has been said. What we need are political forms which allow people to continue to organize when there is no big mass movement, so that there is an infrastructure that will survive the movement itself. Lots of people who actually come to demonstrations think this is an interesting outing. I'm going to go home. I'm angry about this, that, or the other. But what you need if you're going to actually stay alive is you need an educational program. You need a newspaper. They tried, Occupy had a newspaper for a couple of 3 times, but then they abandoned the newspaper. Newspaper, I don't mean just hardcover. I mean, you can have it online. But that has to provide a continuous version, a standpoint from this movement to have some kind of longevity. And I don't think Occupy succeeded in that regard.
So, Rachel, when you look at some of the movements in other countries, and again, citing some of the more authoritarian regimes than the United States or Brazil, as Professor Naím mentioned. Do you think the Occupy model can work elsewhere? Everybody's talking about Ukraine now, where a street movement did topple the pro-Russian president, but then the Russian troops moved in, and who knows how that's going to wind up. But is it different from regime to regime, or do you think it's basically the same, or haven't you looked at it?
I haven't really looked at it. I'm curious to hear you say the phrase an Occupy model, because to me that in and of itself doesn't actually resonate with my understanding of Occupy. Well, it
There
does
is
in
no
a way.
Occupy model?
Well, I think the model is more one of like iteration and emergence, and being kind of it's contingent on the context in which the mobilization is occurring. So I would definitely strongly advocate against the idea that we can just pick up one model of mobilization and activism and just like transplant it into other areas. To me, that sounds like a form of kind of activist colonization or something.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, that's my response to your question.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, or it's people learning what works from other like-minded people.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely.
And applying tools.
Yeah, but maybe not so much application in terms of that we just kind of pick it up and just like land it on top of kind of some like pre-existing conditions, but more that we engage with other people's ideas and we think through how do these work, how do they not work within our particular context.
Professor Naím, can you just give us a thought before you go on your country of origin, Venezuela, where you've been involved in anti-Chavez politics, but it wasn't one of the examples in the article one way or another. And of course, there were big street protests around Venezuela over the last year or two. There were also elections. So what's the Venezuela story as you see it?
Well, it will require a longer program than this one, and we have had it, Brian, in the past. The essence of the story of Venezuela is that it's an underreported, misunderstood tragedy. What's going on there is no longer about electoral politics, the left versus the right, liberal versus liberal, or the north versus the south, or a poor country confronting the empire of the United States, as they call it there. What we have now is very basic human rights violations. Today, Human Rights Watch issued a report, a scathing, harrowing report about disappearances and torture and detention of young activists in the streets. Things that we had not seen in Latin America since the military juntas of the 70s and 80s. They're back, and they're back in force in Venezuela, except that now they know how to do it. And it's a postmodern way of repression in which you mask the data, you hide behind all kinds of democratic appearances. But in fact, this is a militaristic government filled with the military officers that are repressing a very large group of Venezuelans. That
so in our last 30 seconds, is there a postmodern response to that that would be the most effective?
Well, as you know, I believe in political parties. I believe that politics requires political parties, and that it is very important to do the daily grind, the daily very important organizing and fundraising and motivating, aided by social media, but the basics continue to be, politics continue to be an essentially human undertaking, and we should never forget that that takes place in a more effective way when it's done in person.
Stanley, your face tells me you want to get in a last word here. You want to sneak a quick one in?
Yeah, but see, I mean, although the formal position is correct, my concern is that we have you think we have a great free democratic system. We don't. What we have is a democratic mask for a lot of repression. And one of those forms of repression was Occupy's repression with 17 other places, sites, where 18 mayors swept out by force. 18 implantations, and others took place that didn't get very well reported.
Street encampments.
What?
Street encampments.
Street
encampments.
Yeah, street
in
encampments.
Different cities.
That's correct. In different cities, and you have to take into account that we really don't have that much freedom, in the sense that mass demonstrations and protests are barely tolerated, and when they get too effective in this country, they are not tolerated at all.
The last
And I think
word
that's where
in
I would
this
say.
discussion, which could be the first word of a whole other discussion.
Right.
Stanley, Rachel, Moisés, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Brian.
Time for Public Intellectual, where we look at new research with the power to change our minds and public policy. A new report reveals some good news, that the high school graduation rate nationwide surpassed 80% for the first time. For 3 decades before the year 2000, those rates stagnated at 70%, but then they started rising gradually but steadily. In New York City, the graduation rate has long been lower, but has also risen in parallel to the national numbers. But even with these steep increases, a local study shows that high school graduation does not equate to college readiness for all students. Here to explain, Adriana Villavicencio, Research Associate at the New York University Steinhardt Research Alliance for New York City Schools. Her report is called Moving the Needle, Exploring Key Levers to Boost College Readiness Among Black and Latino Males in New York City. Welcome to our program.
Thank you for having me.
What exactly did you set out to measure in your study?
We wanted to do a few things with that study. One was to look at the trajectories of students, in particular Black and Latino males, because they have had lower graduation rates over the last 12 years and even before that. But we also wanted to look at some of the sources for those disparities, both in school sources and also out of school factors that could be contributing to those disparities and college graduation, college readiness gaps.
College readiness. In what ways do you measure college readiness and distinguish it from merely getting a high school diploma?
So the measure that we use in the report is called the Aspirational Performance Measure, or APM. This is a state measure that really measures whether a student got a 75 in English on the English Regents exam and an 80 in math. And of course earned a Regents diploma. If a student earned all of those 3 things, then they are considered by that measure college ready. Of course, that's not a perfect measure because, as you see in the report, some students who did not necessarily were deemed college ready still enrolled in college. So right now the Research Alliance is actually trying to create some better measures of college readiness so that we'll be able to better say what college readiness actually means.
Is the metric that you just laid out an argument for standardized testing, that the education at different schools around New York State, let's say, may be of such disparate quality that the way you figure out if students are really learning a certain basic body of knowledge to make them ready for college would be a test that's the same for everybody statewide at the same grade?
I think we're still trying to, as I said before, figure out a better measure for college readiness, one that actually predicts with some validity whether students persist in college. That's what we really want to know. It's not just important that you get into college, but can you graduate, can you persist past your first year and actually attain a diploma in 4 or 5 years. So we're really trying to figure out a better measure that's not just based on test scores. It could be a combination of attendance or grades, GPA, SAT scores to really figure out what predicts college attainment.
So are those the variables that you were trying to tease out independently in your study?
Sure, those are some of the things that we look at. We call it a leaky pipeline because you see that there are some students that start high school actually on track to graduate, and because they have a drop off in attendance, drop off in credit accumulation, they're not able to actually graduate on time or graduate by this measure college ready. So those are some of the things that we looked at. But we also wanted to look at some of the outside factors, some of the things that affect students outside of school.
Such as?
Poverty. I think almost 80% of our students receive free or reduced price lunch. Immigration, cultural barriers. A lot of our students are not from the United States. They're incoming students from other countries. Their parents may not speak English. There are also certain issues that predominantly affect Black and Latino males. Special education, for example. You see Black and Latino males are overrepresented in special education classes. They're also more likely to be suspended or expelled from school, which further prevents them from being in school and graduating on time.
Now, I know there are some programs. The Harlem Children's Zone is one well-known example, but there are also others around the city that engage students outside of school as well as inside of school, specifically aiming toward high school graduation. Do you think that model is one of the things that's really necessary in order to boost high school graduation rates and college readiness beyond where they're kind of stuck right now?
I think it's important. I don't think we can have a complete conversation about education reform and improving students' chances without looking at poverty and without looking at outside factors. But a program like Harlem Children's Zone is very expensive. It's not something that you can necessarily easily replicate across the city and every community. So we have to think more holistically about what schools can do with the resources that they have, trying to get schools that are under-resourced more resources so that they can serve their students better. And I know the Chancellor and Mayor de Blasio have talked about community centers, centers that can help schools serve students more holistically beyond just the academics.
Our screen is showing a graph. I want to compare and contrast two graphs here. This first one from your study is 4-year high school graduation rates by race and gender among students who entered 9th grade in 2002 and 2006. So the dark blue lines are the 2002 graduation rates, the light blue lines, the 2006 freshman class graduation rates, and looks like progress.
It is progress, and I should just note that actually this is, these are 2007 and 11 graduation rates, but they're for students who entered into the 9th grade in 2002 and 2006.
Right.
So, but yeah, the story is the same. You see that there have been some significant increases, in particular for Black and Latino males, as I said before, but there remains serious gaps, both gender and racial gaps. So there's a lot of work yet to be done.
And the next graph, as we see much lower rates in general, are rates of college readiness, excuse me, by race and gender among students who entered 9th grade in those same years. So how does this contrast with the first graph?
I think you'll see that the number started out so low, so the increase, even though college readiness doubled for Black and Latino males and for some of the other groups as well, they still, the gaps are even more dramatic. And of course, across the board, the numbers are still not as high as I think what many people would want them to be.
College readiness, if we look over, folks, to the second to last set of bars on the right, Black males, 9.3% only, 9.3%, ready for college at the end of 4 years of high school?
One of the things that I'll keep saying it is that this again is not, it's an imperfect measure. It's based on Regent scores, and there are certainly another graph that we have in the report shows that about 30% are actually enrolling in college. So even though they weren't deemed college ready, they still are getting into college. We're still trying to figure out if they actually persist in those schools, but there may be a gap between their college readiness rates and what they can actually do in college. But still alarmingly low. A huge reason for the Expanded Success Initiative, which is a citywide initiative focused specifically on college readiness for Black and Latino boys, and in particular to close that gap between high school graduation and college readiness.
Is that a de Blasio administration initiative?
It actually was started under the Bloomberg administration, funded by the Open Society Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies and several other city agencies. And it's part of the Young Men's Initiative, which is focused on not only education, but also health, criminal justice, and jobs as well.
And so what needs to happen, in your opinion, based on your research? Because one could get discouraged by looking at a few decades of history here. There have been generations of reform movements, each of which believes in itself very strongly. You know, going back only maybe 12 years now, the No Child Left Behind structure under Bush, and Ted Kennedy was involved in that, and Bloomberg did a local version of that for New York. Now something different is going to come in with de Blasio, but then there was something else that also had a lot of energy behind it before No Child Left Behind, and yet we are where we are.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think seeing that the graduation rates at least have not been stagnant, for groups is promising. There are several different ways or reasons for explaining some of that progress. I think some of it is because of the influx of new small schools in the city. There are almost 200 new small schools since 2001. And these schools have been shown by independent studies from MDRC to be more successful and actually to raise graduation rates, particularly for these students. But there are some other things that seem promising, focusing on middle school so that students actually come prepared by the time they get into the 9th grade, when they enter high school to actually do well there. Focusing on the 9th grade year because it is such a predictive year in terms of high school graduation and college readiness. Focusing on some of those things that I said that target Black and Latino students, the special education classes, making sure that every behavior problem is not being treated as suspension or expulsion. And finally, and this is harder for a school system to do, but trying to tackle some of the underlying poverty and socioeconomic issues that really affect many of our students.
So from a researcher's standpoint, what's the next thing you would try to study?
So we're doing a few things. One is we're evaluating this Expanded Success Initiative to see if there's any traction and which specific programs and services have the most traction for Black and Latino males. I'm also releasing a report, hopefully in the next few months, on small schools themselves and looking at how they actually did achieve some of that success and how they were able to sustain it over time. And the college readiness, I think, is a big part of what we're trying to do, not only trying to figure out a better measure for college readiness, but also tracking how students are persisting and doing in college when they get there.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
How well can you read a map? Most likely it's one thing we still do as human beings better than a computer, which is exactly why the New York Public Library labs, yes, labs, needs our help. The library has been digitizing thousands of maps from their archive in an effort to create an online tool that will let everyone travel through the disappearing history of our wonderful city. But there's just one wrinkle. Old maps fade over time and become increasingly harder for computers to understand. And that's where we New Yorkers enter the picture. Here to show and tell us more about their latest crowdsourcing project called Building Inspector is Ben Vershbow, manager of New York Public Library Labs. Yes, I said labs. Welcome to the show.
It's great to be here.
And
Brian.
labs and New York Public Library are not words that people often associate together. So what is NYPL Labs?
Well, NYPL Labs is a small unit of librarians, designers, and software developers who are working in various ways to reimagine the library for the internet age, and with a particular focus on the rare and unique material, the kind of primary source documents, historical records the library's collected for over a century across the 4 research centers that we have here. So we are trying to work with digital material, digitized material, and figure out what then happens. What do you do with it once it goes onto the web? Do you just put it on a web page with a little description, or do you need to develop it more and enrich it more so that it can both be more easily found and discovered, but actually used in new ways for new kinds of research, education, creativity?
So tell me a story, or should I say, show me a story.
Sure. Well, let me tell you about what we're doing with our Building Inspector project. So, as you said, working with historical maps, we're actually training computers to get better at reading these things so we can get some of the wonderful detail that's in our historical maps. So what we've done is we've pushed computers to the extent that we can to recognize shapes off these old maps, footprints and other information. And now we're asking the public's help to index it and identify it and correct it. So this is the Building Inspector website, which can be accessed very conveniently on a phone as well. It'll reformat to a nice small screen size. And as you can see here in this kind of general orientation, there's 4 main tasks that we're asking people's help to do. And this is to kind of basically check the computer's work. I'll take you into that one here. That's the checking footprints task.
And footprints in this case means the footprint of a building.
Of individual
right?
buildings. Now the maps we're looking at here, the library's map division has over 500,000 maps that cover all periods in history, all parts of the world. What we're looking at here are 19th century New York City urban maps down to building footprint scale, and these were commissioned by insurance companies who were trying to understand what buildings were made of and what they were used for so they could calculate insurance policies. What was the risk of this thing exploding or burning down?
And those are particular addresses at Remsen Street?
Exactly.
And it's 107, Remsen Street, 109, the one that's lightened.
Exactly. So the addresses are one of the types of information we're trying to get, but in this task here, the checking footprints, we're giving you something that the computer spotted. Now, it did an okay job in this case. It actually lumped 4 buildings together. You can see some of the lines have gotten a little faded. The computer is relatively stupid. It's just very fast and good at math. And so what it's done here is it's gotten tripped up on a couple of these blurred edges. So the task here is to identify this as something that needs fixing. So we're flagging that as a fix. Here's an area where it's both caught on a little seam and it's actually looking at something that's not colored, so that means it's an open courtyard. So that's a no. I'm clicking no. And so you can see these are very bite-sized tasks. This is something where it got part of a building, but it also got snagged into that courtyard. So I'm going to say that's a fix. So you can see these are very bite-sized tasks that we're asking the public to help with. The slogan of the website is "Kill time, make history." So we're hoping that this is something that you might be able to do while waiting in line for the bus or on your way to work, that it's something you can spend a few minutes on and actually help us over time create a mountain of very important historical data.
And again, by doing what as an individual, if I have those few minutes waiting for the bus, what would I actually do on the site?
Exactly the task I'm showing you here. So in that case, just identifying, did the computer identify these footprints correctly? And therefore, can we move on and start adding other information to them? In this task, this is the footprint fixer. It's taking the things that the community agrees need to be fixed. We don't just ask one person. We're going to put the same things in front of multiple people so make sure that we can ensure quality. And then here, I'm going to start to actually edit this polygon. I'm just dragging markers. This works well on a phone or on a touch screen, as it were. You could just drag this around with a touch interaction, and then I save that. And then it'll give me another one. And you can see it's keeping a score of what I'm doing. So it's sort of like a game. There's no real way to win. The big win is that the information becomes open.
Because you're looking at 2 different things. The original map as an image, photographic image, and the computer's reading of that map.
Exactly.
And you're making them match up.
Yes.
So it's like the Wikipedia of map digitization.
It's very similar to that. We're basically asking the community to build a resource that's too big for us to build on our own.
And are people really doing this?
They are indeed. We've this is an early pilot phase. We did a small pilot in the fall with just the checker task. We've added 3 new tasks: the ability to fix the footprints, the ability to add their addresses, and the ability to ID their colors, which means something on the map. They correspond to what buildings were made of, what they were used for. The reason we're doing this, again, is that when we digitize maps, what we get is essentially a bunch of pixels. And they're very visually interesting to look at. And if you're looking at an individual map, there's plenty that you can discern just by reading the markings and with your eyes. But if we want to be able to do things at a larger scale with our maps, like think about the way you use maps today on your phone or on a computer. I mean, they're astonishing. You can very seamlessly adjust scale and location, and then you can query other information through the map. I mean, most obviously you can type in a place or an address and it'll know exactly where to drop the pin, but then you can actually look at pictures of the street views, you can look at traffic and weather conditions, you can look at where businesses are. We want to be able to do that with our historical maps.
What are some of your favorite historical maps?
Well, we're pretty focused right now on these insurance atlases because they've got this incredible detail down to the footprint level. I mean, this is just a kind of a gold mine, and for urban history, and also as folks who build websites and web projects around these materials, in wanting our old maps to work like new maps, they've got that granularity of detail. They've got the individual addresses, and the thing is about studying historical geography is places change over time. The names change, the address numbering schemes change. So it's actually a real problem for folks trying to look at history in a temporal context, that the computers literally don't know where to drop the pins.
We have about 2 minutes left.
Okay.
You want to show me real quick another example of what NYPL Labs is up to?
Absolutely.
You were showing me some really cool stuff before we went on the air.
Absolutely. So this is a project we launched a few years ago that's been very successful, where we have an amazing archive of historical restaurant menus. They go back to the mid-19th century, really the beginnings of public dining culture. And researchers started to ask questions about these menus that kind of transcended the documents themselves. They were wanting to track a particular dish over time or look up prices of things, kind of historical culinary trends analysis. And so we were thinking that not only should we digitize these menus, but we really want to get at the information in them, which is hard to do automatically. Again, the computers can only get us so far. So this is a transcription project where we've got a few things open to transcribe right now.
You going to show me a really old menu here?
I'm going to show you a menu from, let's see, this is a this is an old menu from, I'm going to have to go back to tell you the date, so apologies. It's from 1913. So, and here you simply click on an individual dish and then transcribe it. So I'm just going to write sardines, boneless, and it's going to ask me for a price as well. So of course that's 30 cents.
And this is in a category that at the time it looks like they called relishes.
Exactly, yes. So they're endlessly fascinating to engage with, which is I think why these projects work. The participation is sort of its own reward. You know, these are both incredibly familiar. Everyone has looked at the menu. Everyone's ordered something off the menu.
And this is a crowdsourcing project too, because I know a lot more people who'd be interested in going back and helping you put together old menus than old insurance maps.
Well, yes, this is also a crowdsourcing project. The maps, I think that once you get oriented, it's rewarding in a different way. It's almost calming. There's like you're correcting shapes, you're identifying colors. What the people who have gotten really engaged with it have gotten really. People say it's totally addictive. I can't stop doing it. So we're hoping that, and eventually to add an offline mode, so you can do it on your subway commute. Then you have today's buildings whizzing above your head, and you're indexing yesterday's buildings.
Give us the web address. Where can people go either to see more or to help you?
You can find more about all our projects at labs.nypl.org, and it's at buildinginspector.nypl.org or here menus.nypl.org. So those projects can all be found there.
Good luck with it. Thanks
Thank you very much.
And that's our program for this week. You will find a new show here each week at this hour. And do tune into my radio program weekdays 10 a.m. to noon on WNYC 93.9 FM and AM 820. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.